Welcome to CNI Jerusalem, calling your source for unfiltered Mideast talk radio. I'm your host, Faye Williams, and we're going to be talking with Trip Jennings today, who's just returned home on Tuesday from the occupied Palestinian territories, where he worked as media coordinator for the International Solidarity Movement. For months, Jennings has lived on the street with Palestinian families who were forcefully evicted by Jewish settlers in occupied East Jerusalem. He was on the ground in Jerusalem's Old City when tension erupted into violence last month, and 2 weeks ago he was an eyewitness to the controversial Nablus killings. As media coordinator, he managed and distributed reports from activists across the West Bank and Gaza, working closely with the Popular Struggle Coordination Committee, a grassroots framework of Palestinian communities actively resisting the occupation. A popular speaker on tour with National Geographic, Trip has a history of environmental and social activism. He's discovered and kayaked the underground source of the Pandy River in Papua New Guinea, taken the first scientific instruments down wild sections of the Congo and Mekong rivers, and produced video documentaries against clear-cutting and mining in wilderness areas in Canada and the United States. Hello, Trip. How are you?
Doing just fine. Glad to be here.
I know that you were in the Middle East recently. Would you tell our listeners why you were there?
I was inspired to go to the Middle East and do the work that I was doing in Palestine after reading a book called Witness in Palestine, where a woman took a picture in the occupied West Bank. She took a picture of an olive farmer who was being arrested, taken by the Israeli military. He was released, beaten and a bit tortured, but alive. And the people that she was with, the other Palestinians, said that, likely because the soldiers saw her taking a picture, that person wasn't killed, wasn't arrested for longer. It was at that point that I realized that, wow, internationals can go to Palestine and potentially have a positive effect on the human rights situation there. So that's what I went to do.
I see. I probably have visited many of the places that you went, and I remember where Palestinians were standing talking with our group. The Israeli soldiers just came up and started jabbing them and pushing them out of the way with their guns, which I found just very unsettling in what is called the only democracy in the Middle East. I'm sure you witnessed some of that, perhaps in some of the places you went. Tell us, what is the International Solidarity Movement, and what do they do?
The International Solidarity Movement is a Palestinian-directed organization that works to connect international volunteers with communities that participate in the popular resistance to the occupation. Sometimes that means, internationals are on the ground observing and documenting human rights violations, and sometimes it means actively taking part in the nonviolent resistance. I sort of like to think of it as using our privilege as passport-holding internationals to directly address the implementation of international law and highlight where it's being violated. An example of that is 2004, when the International Court of Justice in The Hague ruled that the wall Israel is building, largely in the West Bank, violates international law. They said that Israel should stop construction and dismantle what had been built. But not much has been done on the ground to actually make that happen. When ISM volunteers stand in the way of bulldozers that uproot olive trees or destroy Palestinian children's playground in the future path of the wall, as we did near Bethlehem, we're really working to support international law, an internationally consensed-on idea that's being challenged and violated on the ground.
Here in the United States, in the civil rights movement, there were lots of young people involved in the movement. I wonder if you noticed that to be true in Palestine.
There are activists in Palestine from many different generations, but certainly the ISM is largely people in their 20s, and we met people all over the occupied territories, young people like ourselves working for the same things.
You stayed in an area predominantly populated by Palestinians that were evicted from East Jerusalem. What was their reaction to this? What was their mood, and how were they handling that? I know this has been going on for a long time.
This has been going on for a long time, but the families that I was living with were evicted in August 2009. We stayed with them as they lived on the street outside of the house that the small children had been born in, as well as the family patriarch was born in. We sat in between them and the soldiers that were preventing them from entering their house, of course. So we sat with them through the cold, rainy Jerusalem winter. I'm constantly amazed by their ability to stay incredibly incredibly positive and stay very hopeful at returning to their houses, and incredibly inviting to internationals as well. I mean, constantly showering us with tea and coffee and delicious Palestinian food.
That's one of the things that I noticed, even though they have very little, especially when they've been moved out of their home, but they always want to share what they have with others who come. And you mentioned sitting between the Israeli soldiers and the Palestinians. I've had that experience, too. There were times when the Israelis were coming in, cutting down the olive trees, and we stood between the soldiers and the olive trees and the people. It's an experience. It's very unsettling, but you just feel that you want to do something, you have to do something, because, as you said, here are homes that people have lived in for generations, and then suddenly they find themselves with their homes boarded up. I wonder if the homes that you saw when you sat with them were boarded up so that they could not go into the home.
Quite the opposite. Just a few hours after they were evicted in August, Israeli settlers moved in to the houses. This is part of a plan of changing the ethnic demographic of the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah that I was in and much of East Jerusalem where we were. Every day, the family had to watch as the military protected the Israeli settlers who freely went in and out of their house and lived in their house while they were forced to live in tents on the street in the rain.
Unless you've been there, it's hard to imagine what you're talking about, but having been there myself, I just visualize all of what you're saying. But many of the times when I went, the homes were boarded up or were actually knocked down. Did you see any where the young people may have thrown rocks? That the Israeli forces came in and knocked down a part of the house, saying they're knocking down the part that child lived in. Did you see any of that?
I wasn't actually present for any home demolition. In that area of Sheikh Jarrah in occupied East Jerusalem, the tactic doesn't seem to be demolishing homes, but occupying the homes themselves. What we did see is unpermitted additions to homes, which in the United States, maybe they would have been demolished since the builders didn't obtain the proper permits. But instead of being demolished, somehow that ended up transferring ownership, in some cases of just the addition, so half of the house the Palestinians were living in, transferring that ownership to Jewish Israeli settlers.
Welcome back to CNI Jerusalem Calling, your source for unfiltered Mideast radio talk. Again, I'm Faye Williams, your host, and we're talking with Trip Jennings about the occupied territories and a recent trip that he made there. Well, first of all, did you witness the Nablus killings?
Yes, I was in the crowd quite close to where the two teenagers were killed.
Would you tell us a little bit about that situation?
I think one of the things that you really don't get very often from the news is the backstory on what's going on and what the situation is that created the tension. So the village of Iraq-Barin, where we had gone to participate in and sort of observe as well a demonstration that was being held by the Palestinian residents on their land. The reason that they were doing that is because there's a history in Iraq-Barin and all over the West Bank where Palestinians live near settlements of the Israeli settlers moving in and building a settlement on Palestinian land for which the Palestinians are not compensated or consulted before their land is used. And so Iraq-Barin is next to a settlement called the Bracha settlement, which is annexed over 100,000 square meters of the village's farmland. At first, every Friday, and then later on, 2009, every Saturday, the village began gathering, attempting to reach a spring, which had been annexed by the settlement, by settlers who oftentimes carry guns and oftentimes can be very violent. So they weren't allowed to reach the spring that they've been using for generations for their traditional farming. So 2.5 weeks ago, I was there with another international volunteer to participate in any way that we could in the demonstration. It was a demonstration like none I've ever been to. Immediately, when we began to walk out of the village, we were confronted with soldiers with M16 assault rifles. They began shooting live rounds over our heads, which was very different from any demonstration that I'd ever been to in the West Bank. Normally, the first thing that happens is in order to disperse, and if people don't disperse, then there's non-lethal crowd dispersal methods used, like tear gas or what they call stun grenades, or even rubber bullets. None of these non-lethal crowd dispersal methods were used. After 2 hours or so, the demonstration ended. I left the front very quickly after they began firing live rounds at us. So 2.5 hours after the demonstration had begun, maybe half an hour after it had ended, two boys were dropped off in a service taxi, as they call it. At that time, a number of jeeps with soldiers in them entered entered the village. They arrested 3 teenagers, young teenagers. 2 of the boys that were dropped off by the taxi, who hadn't even participated in the demonstration, were shot and killed by the Israeli military just after 3 o'clock.
Was it understood by the authorities that you were there for peaceful purposes? You certainly were not armed, were you?
Well, we certainly were not armed, and no one in the village was. I mean, the International Solidarity Movement has a very strict nonviolent rule. I've never seen a Palestinian with a weapon outside of the Palestinian Authority police, none of whom were present. It's very clear at many of these demonstrations that happen every week across the West Bank that they're unarmed demonstrators there.
Were there Palestinian women and children involved in this demonstration, and were they treated any different from the men?
There were indeed women and young teenagers, 12, 13-year-old, at the demonstration, but the shootings happened after the demonstration, which is, I think, one of the more disconcerting elements of it.
That's unfortunate, and again, I said, unless you've actually been there and you've seen this, you can't imagine how awful it is, and of course your life is never the same after you've been to the Palestinian-occupied territories. Since they knew that you were on a peace mission, I guess they thought, as one of my books says, you were peace terrorists, because that's certainly the way that you can be treated by these Israeli Defense Forces from what I have seen. There is a caller for a moment who's called in and asked people to, once they leave the show, to go to YouTube video of Dr. Walid Khalidis' speech to the United Nations. So we hope that some of you will want to do that. Recently, the Israeli military criticized the actions of the IDF soldiers who shot the 4 Palestinians, including the one 15-year-old. Do you know how they will handle that, how the Israelis will handle it? Do they pay for funeral expenses? Will these persons who shot them have any consequences for their actions?
I certainly can't say exactly what the Israeli military will do. It's an unusual circumstance that they do actually criticize their own soldiers for an act like this. You know, we're going to have to follow this event to see what happens. To me, it's very important that people are held responsible for obvious and I think very blatant human rights violations like this. To me, it's not just the Israelis that need to take note of this and have a response. I think it's also the United States government, which provides monetary and material support for units like this one that operate in violation of human rights in the West Bank. Many of the weapons that they use, many of the bullets that they use are made in the United States. I think that we need to follow this case and make sure that this does not continue to happen. Our resources.
I always hear people in the U.S. say, well, we don't give the Israelis money to buy guns or to do destruction, but if you pay for my food, then I've got more money to buy clothing. So I don't think that works, and the United States should ask the Israelis to be more accountable with the funds we do send them, and I think that's what's missing. When you think about a 15-year-old being shot, I think that's just incredible, and there should be outrage on the part of the people in Israel as well as from around the world. It's unfortunate that more people don't speak out on the issue, and that's why we in the Council for the National Interest decided someone must speak out. We do that. You know, Dr. Martin Luther King during the Civil Rights Days called upon us to speak out. He said we must speak out. You know, otherwise we're being traitors to what we say that we believe in, if we believe in human rights, and yet we say nothing when we see these atrocities happening. And it's not like this is the only time that something like this happens in the occupied territories. We call upon people, not just you, and I thank you for what you've done in going there and coming back and telling the story, but I call upon our listeners to also speak out when we hear things like this happening to people who, for no reason other than the fact that they are Palestinian. You're listening to CNI Jerusalem, calling your source for unfiltered Mideast radio talk. I'm your host, Faye Williams, and we have a few callers on the line. Hello, Dave. How are you from New Jersey?
Hi, good afternoon. I have a question. Why we are not seeking relief from the U.S. courts under Alien Tort Claim Act against the Israeli leadership and the military for human genocide?
Do you know if anyone has filed a complaint?
Why we are not doing it?
No, that's what I'm saying. Do you know of anyone who might have?
Nobody has filed for relief in U.S. courts under Alien Tort Claims Act against the Israeli government or the Israeli military. And recently, Indian organization Sikhs for Justice, they filed the similar case for 1984 riots in which the Sikhs were targeted.
Maybe at your suggestion, someone might do that. It's possible.
We must do it. We must do it.
Then perhaps in your role, you can continue to urge people to do that. Trip, did you have anything to say about that?
There's a law in the books called the Leahy Law that attempts to prevent U.S. funding and U.S. aid from going to military units internationally that operate with impunity and violating human rights. It's very difficult to get very much criticism to come out of the United States government of Israel. But I think this is a very clear example of a violation of human rights. What we need to do is attempt to get a congressperson to initiate a Leahy Law investigation. And I think that's one step at sort of chipping away at the wall here.
You've just said the magic word, a congressperson. Let us hope that someone is courageous enough to do that. Many congresspeople are more concerned about getting reelected than they are about human rights, but it's certainly something that someone might think of doing if that, you believe, would be answer to it. We want to see if there is someone who might come forward now that they know that they can do that kind of thing. A lot of times we assume people know what they can do to remedy a situation, but they don't always know that. We will hope for it. We're all human beings, and nothing should be alien to us as human beings, and it's certainly not human the way that our Palestinian brothers and sisters have been treated for so many years. Maybe this will spark someone to do something about that. As long as we continue to give aid to someone, it seems that we should have expectations. We want to thank Dave for calling in and making that suggestion, and we're going to go right now to Preston.
What I'm curious is, recently we're witnessing pretty much kind of a tectonic shift here in U.S.-Israeli relations with Netanyahu's statement of there be basically no two-state solution. So my question is, do peace movements and the CNI Foundation, do they see long-term changes in how we are going to approach our relationship? Because the United States has based a lot of its relationship in the past 20 years or so working towards the goal of a two-state solution, or at least giving the appearance of doing so. And now that we seem to be kind of an impasse between our government and Netanyahu, I'm just curious if that's going to change or alter your approach to the peace process and your efforts.
I think it's a very good point, and it's also one that's not lost on Palestinians on the ground. In the weeks before I left, Palestinians were much more excited to hear that I'm an American than they had been for my entire stay. And so I think there's definitely hope on the ground that this will potentially have a more significant response from the United States. I think what we need to do, albeit a difficult to attain goal, is to leverage the significant influence that our government has, we as taxpayers in America have, to put pressure on the Netanyahu government, the Israeli government, to work towards some sort of a solution, whether it's two-state or whether it's some sort of a binational one-state solution.
I've noticed that the Palestinian people place a lot of hope on anything that they see an American doing, and I wish more Americans would visit the occupied territories. They have that wonderful ability to separate us from our actions or inactions from our government. I think the majority of the American people want to see this situation settled and handled fairly and with justice. We in America, who know what's going on in Palestine, have this hope that our government will someday understand the power it has in this situation and speak up and commit to some action for resolving the problem. Are IDF soldiers normally this forceful when dealing with Palestinians as that you witnessed?
Thankfully, it was abnormal to have two Palestinian teenagers killed at a demonstration. That said, it's very frequent that there are violent interactions between the two. Just the week before I left, a friend that I had been working with who was a member of the Popular Coordination Committee, so someone who helps organize the unarmed and nonviolent demonstrations in the West Bank, was picked up at a checkpoint when they recognized his name and the village that he was from. And he was held for a week, tortured. Now he walks with a limp and has sort of fuzzy spots in his vision. He has scars on his back from where he was electrocuted while he was in prison for a week. And then he was released with no charges. Yes, it is common that there's a very violent interaction between soldiers and Palestinians.
And we have another caller on the line, David from West Virginia. Let's go to David.
My question for Mr. Jennings is, when you and the other people in the ISM witness these atrocities and the general conditions that the Palestinians have to deal with, do you attempt to communicate that to American media, and what response do you get?
Media, especially coming from human rights observers and activists on the ground, is very important. It's a crucial tool to chipping away the links of the occupation. It's actually quite difficult to get American media to really cover what's happening on the ground, even when it happens to American citizens. The day before the Nablus killings, a good close friend from Bellingham, Washington, was shot with a rubber bullet. The bullet lodged in her arm. It broke her arm. I watched as the sort of primitive tools were used to remove it at the hospital in the West Bank, and we had very little success at getting any media in the United States to cover it, which has been similar with the Nablus killings. It's certainly part of our strategy. We end up focusing often on other countries which are more receptive to the important stories that are coming out of the West Bank and Gaza.
I'm just wondering if you've recovered from your trip there. Usually this takes quite a bit of time for recovery when you get back. How are you doing now?
Well, I think it will take me months, if not years, to process my experience there. Part of the processing for me as well is using my experience and really leveraging the new knowledge that I have to attempt to make some sort of a change here in the United States.
Welcome back to CNI Jerusalem Calling, your source for unfiltered Mideast Talk Radio. I'm your host, Faye Williams, and we're talking with Trip Jennings, who's recently been to the Middle East, just returned, and is recovering. And, Trip, if you don't mind, we're going to go to another caller, Howard in Virginia. Hello, Howard. How are you?
I have a question or a response to your question about why is there not more outrage on the part of the American public and maybe courage on the part of Congress to do something about these. And it's my impression that probably the average American thinks that Palestinians support terrorism or are terrorists themselves, perhaps. It's a sort of a stereotypical misconception there, probably. And Americans probably are not really aware of the extent to which Israel is basically practicing a form of apartheid against people that are their own citizens. Part of the issue with the Congress in particular is the influence of the Israel lobby, AIPAC and others, on our members of Congress. So I'm just wondering what Trip would see about that on the ground in Palestine.
At this point on the ground in the West Bank, the idea of nonviolent resistance is incredibly popular and catching on and I think growing in popularity. We're not dealing with Palestinian terrorists. We're not dealing with an armed resistance right now. We're dealing with a resistance that's much more that which we saw from Gandhi, resisting a form of apartheid which people who've been in both South Africa during apartheid and the West Bank say is very comparable or potentially worse in the West Bank right now. That's what I saw on the ground.
Well, Howard, we certainly want to thank you for your comments and for your question. You're absolutely right. I think with increased information, the American people will be more demanding of our own government. Trip, I just wanted to ask if you're going to be any place around the country where listeners can go to hear you to talk about what you saw in the occupied territories.
I'm going to be heading back to Oregon, which is home most of the time. I don't have specific dates set up at this point, but I will be trying to speak about my experiences as much as possible. I think that's a very important next step.
With the Israeli military violence in the occupied territories, there's obviously an increased need for a peace agreement. So I wonder if there's something we can say to peace groups out there that they should be doing right now to make that more possible or possible sooner than later.
The core of any peace agreement is a homeland for, obviously, Palestinians and Israelis, and I think that has everything to do with land on the ground and land disputes. And as settlement development and settlement expansion continues, it's going to be incredibly difficult to have any sort of an equitable peace process happening. So I think the peace groups should be working hard to make sure that the inflammatory announcements by the Israeli government of settlement expansion, while, for example, Biden is there, or during the AIPAC conference, we need to use this opportunity, I think, at a bit of outrage from the U.S. government to push the Israelis to stop settlement expansion and stop new developments.
We have another caller. We have John from Virginia on the line. Hello, John.
First of all, I'd like to commend Trip on what he's done. It takes a lot of guts to go over there and face up to the IDF, especially considering how brutal they've been towards the Palestinians over so many years. The comment I had to, actually it's more of a comment than a question. I think I'm sort of an old hand. I've been following this situation for decades now. The solution ultimately is going to, it seems like it's going to rest with the United States as to whether or not it's willing to agree with the rest of the world that changes need to be made within Israeli policies towards the Palestinians if there's ever going to be any sort of resolution to it. From my experience, there's been a lot of people working on this issue for a long time here in the United States. Maybe I shouldn't say a lot of people, but there have been a number of organizations, and they've had pretty much zero luck in terms of changing U.S. policy. One of the reasons is, as you mentioned before, the media. The media doesn't help. The media seems to be in the Israeli camp. The other is, and the consequence of that is, in fact, most, generally speaking, American people are oblivious or just don't know enough about the situation to get involved in it. And just recently, I've been trying to get people to focus on their churches as a possible means of developing some sort of political clout. In other words, to get the numbers up. There are people out there, increasing numbers of people who know what's going on, especially since 9/11. There's been increased attention to the Middle East. But still, the numbers in terms of people who really want to, try to do something politically is still too low to have any effect. And so what I'm trying to figure out is a real strategy to increase those numbers. And my thinking is that the churches are the way to go.
Well, I want to thank you, John, for that, and I would agree with that. Trip, I want to ask if you have a last or a closing comment before we go.
Well, I certainly agree with that. I think it's important to realize that it's not just Muslims, but there's many Christians as well that are prevented from being able to worship freely in the occupied territories. We need to generate more numbers and generate more activists to, create an equitable solution to this problem.
Let us all pray for our brothers and sisters in Palestine as well as in Israel, because there are many peace activists there. We're going to pray for world peace for everyone, but while we're praying for it, let us also work for peace and justice. Let us continue to lean on our government and let it know what power it has to do something about the situation in the Middle East. We want everyone to become involved in this issue because ultimately it does affect all of us. Because ultimately it does affect all of us. Because ultimately